Hello and welcome to another episode of the Geo Interview. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor Richard Ned Lebow, who is Professor Emeritus of International Political Theory at King's College London, Honorary Fellow of Pembroke College, University of Cambridge, and Visiting Professor at the University of Siena and the European University Institute in Florence. Professor Lebow has authored more than 50 books and nearly 400 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Our conversation today will largely delve into practical approach to conflict prevention and management, wherein Professor Richard will shed some light on how his work affects our understanding of contemporary global governance and policymaking. A very warm morning to you, sir, today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and very pleased to be here and looking forward to your questions and hope that the listeners will find my answers of interest.
Surely, sir. And it's an absolute honor for us to be hosting you today.
Thank you.
Professor, let's start with the wide array of conflicts underway across the world and how we are witnessing constant diplomatic shuttles aimed at resolving those conflicts, which have strategic objectives going behind them. In what ways do you believe current global governance structures need to adapt to better address issues of conflict and strategy in this century?
Well, it's a very interesting and, of course, complex question. Global institutions vary enormously in their character and their focus. It's very hard to talk about them in general rather than specific terms. But I think a few observations could nevertheless be made. The first is that they need to be more representative of the world as a whole. Most of these institutions were founded in the West, dominated by Western countries and players, and often by the Americans. This needs to change. There should be more voices in these institutions and a power structure that is more pluralistic. One could start with the United Nations, for example. United Nations has three fundamental pillars as its foundations. The General Assembly, in which all states have one voice and all states are treated as equal, thus enshrining the principle of equality as central, if not dominant, to international affairs. The second is the Security Council, where those states, 5 of them, recognized as great powers, are given responsibilities for security and have a veto. There are other rotating members of the Security Council, but they don't have the veto or the authority of the great powers. And 2 of those great powers are no longer great, Britain and France. They're there as a matter of historical courtesy. So the third pillar is the Economic and Social Council, which recognizes that to have a peaceful world, you not only need an assembly where everybody can voice an opinion and a smaller council that can direct common efforts towards security, you need economic and social well-being of people. That this is ultimately the surest foundation of peace. However, this third wing of the United Nations, while it does important work, is still not as influential as the other 2. And we need to change all of this. And if we do, I think institutions will be more appropriate to the needs of more people in the world.
Right, so I think that's a very important point you've made there, because unless the world is represented proportionally according to their economic weights, according to their population, there's no way the countries can come aboard all the P5 members on every issue that they are facing. Now, Moving forward, sir, given the extensive area of research that you have, can you help us understand the core theoretical insights of your work on IR and how it contributes to our understanding of global conflict and cooperation?
Well, that's an even bigger question than your last one. Uh, I, Let me focus on just one aspect of this theme. Most literature in international relations and international relations theory focuses on one of two motives which are thought to move human beings and states when it comes to foreign policy. Uh, the first of these is appetite. People want material well-being. This is at the core of both the liberal and Marxist paradigms. They understand it very differently, to be sure, but both start from the assumption that people are motivated by material needs and that satisfying material needs in turn allows them to satisfy deeper human needs. The two are closely related. The realist approach to international relations starts from a different assumption, and that is that people, states in international relations are driven by fear. They're driven by fear because the international environment, in contrast to many or most states, is anarchical. It doesn't have authorities capable of providing order. Police, courts, fire departments, if you like. But rather, each state has to look after itself. That brings about concern for security. It brings about fears, even if everybody is benign, some realists say. The very fear that something could happen leads people to acquire armies. They, in turn, then look aggressive to others, and fear is made self-fulfilling. What I've done in my research is to introduce a third motive. And going back to the ancient Greeks, who are, impressive for their level of sophistication about human beings and human culture. All cultures are, of course, unique, but all cultures are composed of human beings. And human beings, no matter what their color, their hair, their size, we're all fundamentally the same. And so what the Greeks theorized is relevant in this sense to other cultures. And they argued, and this is Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, the Greek playwrights, they argued that in addition to appetite, that human beings all want to feel good about themselves, that self-esteem is just as fundamental a drive as appetite. And the way we gain self-esteem is by excelling in activities that are valued by others. By winning the approval or approbation of others, we in turn feel good about ourselves. In international relations, both in Europe, the Indian subcontinent, China at the time of the warring states, anywhere you look, there has been competition among political units. And that competition was often driven, the Greeks theorized, by the desire for recognition and self-esteem. To the extent that you succeeded in whatever was valued, military contests, athletic contests, you name it, you achieved standing and honor, and you felt good about yourselves. This, I have theorized, has been the principal cause of international competition and wars over the ages and in every region of the world. In the modern day, it's been largely hidden in the West because appetite has become so important. And what I've done is to try to bring in this drive back to our understanding of politics and international relations, and to demonstrate first theoretically and then through case studies and data sets just how important it is. And then to think about what can be done, not to do away with it, because you can't do away with human nature, but to channel it in less violent and more productive and cooperative ways. That's my principal contribution to international relations.
So it's very interesting to see that how you brought in a virtue that is so different from the realistic or the Marxist or the capitalist virtues that they put forward, like the material being or the fear, right? And I must appreciate the experience you possess on this topic. Viewers and ardent students of IR and specifically conflict studies stand to benefit from your perspective, surely. Professor, according to you, what are the key principles of effective conflict management and prevention? And how can they be applied to current regional conflicts as mentioned before?
Right. Well, conflict management takes place on several levels. Let me make an analogy here to two people who are hiking in the mountains, which is something I do several times a week. In the summer, my wife and I live in New Hampshire on the slopes of Moose Mountain, and there are moose. And we go hiking up to the top, and most of the rest of the year, we divide between living in Italy, where we're in an Etruscan hill town near a mountain, and London, which is, of course, flat. And you know, if a hiker goes too close to the edge of the cliff, there's a risk of falling off. And once somebody's fallen, there's not so much that can be done to save that person. And crisis management often comes into the game just as the person is at the edge of the cliff, or possibly even after they've fallen off. This is true in economics, it's true in medicine, it's true in international relations. And one of the things that modern medicine has found is that it's far more productive to invest in what doctors call prophylactic medicine, trying to prevent diseases rather than to cure them, and trying to diagnose illnesses very early in their development rather than very late. So we need to do the same with politics. We need to certainly think about what happens at the cliff in acute crises where states may be going to war with one another. But good conflict management takes place much earlier. It asks why these conflicts occur and what might be done to finesse or address them before they become acute, or more fundamentally, to prevent them from happening in the first place. So what I'm suggesting is a shift in our focus, which I think is already taking place. And with it, a recognition of the many problems that arise and the differences, in this case, between politics and medicine. Political conflicts are always at least two-way, and they often represent very different understandings of the same situation. I mean, one need only think of India and Pakistan to take a conflict closer to home, where each side has a very different understanding of how the conflict developed and who's responsible for it. Now, to resolve that or any other conflict, you either need to come to a more common understanding or come to respect that the other side has a different view which they hold as sincerely as you do yours, and use that as a starting point for addressing the problem. So in practice, I've theorized that there are three approaches to conflict management. And I frame them as a kind of triangle because we have three causes of conflict. We have fear, which I've already talked about, which is the realist view. We have self-esteem, and we have appetite, which might be simple clashes of interest over, let's say, where the oil is in the South China Sea and who should have access to it. Very simple, straightforward, if rather nasty conflict. And what happens is in the West, there are two principal mechanisms that have been theorized for addressing this conflict triangle. The first is deterrence, which is you make threats to discourage the other side from using force. China and the US are unfortunately deeply engaged in this kind of deterrent relationship at the moment, which I think you might agree with me is ending up making their relations worse and more conflictual and more threatening rather than less. And the second is diplomacy. And diplomacy starts from the assumption that conflicts are inevitable, that people can, through reason and goodwill, find solutions to them or find ways of living with them. So, for example, staying with the China-United States conflict at the moment, there's no obvious way of peacefully resolving the Taiwan issue, right? China maintains Taiwan is China. Taiwanese fundamentally see themselves as an independent country, but still to maintain relations with China, say, yes, they're part of China. Mao and Nixon worked out an arrangement where everybody would accept this one China solution, although in practice there would be two Chinas. So rather than solving the problem, they found a way around it, a way of finessing the problem that would allow everybody to maintain their position without having overt conflict. And really, what's at stake in the China issue, it comes back to the question of self-esteem. There's no economic or strategic issue at stake here. What's at stake is belief on the part of mainland Chinese that Taiwan is part of China, that it's the last bit of territory that is separate from China because of imperialism and colonial occupation. The belief on the other side of the Taiwanese that they should not be dictated to by a distant power, and with a population of more than half of whom are not Chinese in origin. So self-esteem is a key here, and unless you recognize that and address it, you're not going to solve the problem. So this brings me to the third strategy, which has been under-theorized and under-applied, and it's what Janice Stein and I call reassurance. It's an attempt to reassure somebody about your intentions and also your respect and understanding for their point of view. Reassurance can break the ice and pave the way for discussions that bring about substantive improvement. Think about President Anwar Sadat of Egypt's visit to Israel. A irrevocable move once he had done it, call for peace, which convinced the Israelis that he was serious and ultimately led, with the help of third parties, to a diffusing of Egyptian-Israeli conflict. They had fought 4 wars between 1945 and 1973. Since then, and since their agreement, which is what, 20, 40 something years ago, there's been no war whatsoever, and they tacitly cooperate. So reassurance has to come in as the third leg of a strategy of conflict management, and reassurance, deterrence, and diplomacy all need to be coordinated in a comprehensive and sophisticated way to be used either together or sequentially, depending on the nature of the conflict.
Right, so I think if we take a bottoms-up approach on these 3 strategies that you've mentioned, starting from reassurance, that is, the leadership can say that, yes, we are reassuring my adversary that, yes, we will acknowledge some of your concerns, but we won't lose our ground. And then diplomacy can pave the way forward with the two nations. And then deterrence can be a last resort of maintaining that status quo, right?
Yes. So let's stay for a second with Chinese-American relations, and then we could also look at Arab-Israeli relations, which is an even more difficult problem. U.S. and China might start by having a quiet meeting in which each side beforehand submits a document to the other, listing the things it finds most offensive about the other side's behavior. And they could then negotiate, each agreeing to stop doing or reduce doing what so bothers the other. And I won't go into detail here, but I've written a book on this together with the Chinese, mainland Chinese co-author Feng Zhang, in which we've laid out in detail the kinds of things each side could do to reassure the other, and actually at low cost to itself. And that would create a situation of increased trust and reliability, and also undercut hardliners on both sides who want to push for more conflict and confrontation. If you turn to the Arab-Israeli conflict, you'll see how even more essential these motives linked to conflict resolution are. So both sides, of course, have completely different understandings of what's happening. For Israel, it's always been a homeland of Jews. There have always been Jews present. For Palestinians, it's their homeland, and they see Jews on the whole as interlopers. One side accepted partition, the other side didn't. There are refugees, almost an equal number from both sides, but each only focuses on its own. And now what you have is a situation where Israel is militarily dominant and the Palestinians and their allies not. So they strike back in the only way they can, which is through terrorist attacks against Israeli civilian population. And why do they do this? Well, ask yourself, does it gain anything strategically or economically? No. Every time you do it, Israel responds with attacks several times larger in the consequences. So you end up hurting yourself. But this is where this notion of self-esteem comes in. Palestinians feel empowered by being able to do this. It strengthens their self-esteem, their self-respect. Hamas fighters and Hezbollah have strong support among local populations for this reason. So Israel attacks, and everything Israel does to enhance its security undermines the self-esteem of Palestinians. But almost everything Palestinians do to enhance their self-esteem threatens or undermines Israeli security. So they're locked into a vicious cycle. And there's no way that conflict is going to be reduced in intensity, let alone resolved, without disengaging security from self-esteem. That, of course, will require active involvement of third parties that address not one side or the other, not condemn one side as a war criminal, the other as a victim, or vice versa, but rather figure out ways of both enhancing Israeli security and Palestinian self-esteem in compatible ways, which is, of course, a neat act and more difficult now than in the past. So in the past, one principal route to the solution was the two-state solution, which of course made a lot of sense. But now, because of repeated cycles of violence and counter-violence, there's very little support for a two-state solution in either Israel or among the Palestinians. And in its absence, it will become very difficult to find a solution.
Right, so I think it is very important to note down all these points that you've enlisted, and they should be analyzed thoroughly and should be explored by the two warring parties in Middle East. And it surely will increase the depth of knowledge and understanding we have on the topic, especially the point you've made on the reassurance, which you said is underapplied and underappreciated. So while we know that ideally a decision taken by any nation is not a one man's call, but rather a number of strategies and decisions amalgamated to get one final decision, how do psychological factors influence decision making and learning in the context of international relations and strategy? And it would be great if you can name some of them and give a short explanation on them as well.
Right. Well, human beings like to think of themselves as fully rational, but none of us are. In our personal lives, in our economic lives, in our political lives, we differ from rationalists in important ways. In many questions or decisions, we don't make a full investigation of all of the options. We don't gather all the information that would be relevant. We don't take all the time that would be necessary to distinguish among them. And we don't set up procedures to give us feedback, information about how our choice is working out or not working out. There's nothing wrong with this because there aren't enough hours in the day for human beings to treat every decision as one requiring full vigilance. In fact, we have evolved a series of shortcuts for making decisions that are useful to us in the long run. And psychologists in the cognitive approach to psychology have documented a number of these so-called heuristics that enable people to use shorthands to make decisions. Most times, they're useful. But when we come to decisions that have profound implications, as those about war and peace do, we require more extensive decision-making procedures. They're often lacking. So one of the ways in which psychology is relevant is documenting when and how this occurs and what could be done about it. More fundamentally, what kinds of decisions we make are a function of the assumptions that we bring to the table and our goals, because these assumptions determine how we see the world. If we decide that the person we're dealing with is dishonest and a scoundrel, we're going to behave very differently than if we see our interlocutor as somebody who is truthful and reliable. And our judgments may or may not be right in these instances. So assumptions are critical, but also so is what we want. Cognitive psychology tells us that we see what we want to see, that we have schemas of the world and we assimilate information to it. And you may have seen this. You go to a train station, you're waiting to meet a friend. You have an image in your mind of what your friend looks like. And on occasion, you'll say, that's him. But in fact, it's somebody else. And that person bore superficial relationship. And it's only when you look more close up, you say, no, that's not him. That's cognitive psychology at work. Motivational psychology tells us that we see what we want or need to see. And this can be a very powerful determinant of our decision making and lead us astray in even more fundamental ways. Thus, psychology at the individual level needs to study the ways in which cognition influences behavior and interferes with good decisions, or sometimes promotes it. And they must give equal attention, and this is where my own research is focused, on motivational psychology and what creates the desires, or more importantly, the needs to see things in certain ways, and the belief that other people will understand your needs, which they don't, and act accordingly. Now, that's just individual psychology. In fact, in institutions, politics and international relations are always embedded in institutions. We make decisions not as individuals, but as groups, and as groups acting for these larger units. And here, group psychology and organizational psychology become extremely important in understanding what people do. So increasingly, in international relations, psychology has played an important role. I've been one of many people who have developed the field of political psychology, whereby we bring these two together and not only use psychology to understand politics, but politics to understand psychology. The arrow of influence flows or points in both directions.
Right, sir. I think these points that you've made, these factors that you've put forward, are actually very important when taking any decision. And in my understanding, we cannot be so sure of taking any decisions in our field without any of these factors, as you mentioned before, being involved in some way or other. Now, sir, given the huge state resources which go into intelligence gathering and interpretation, how can intelligence be effectively used in formulating and executing strategies for conflict management and resolution?
Well, the first step is for each of the people involved to step back and think about what's going on. Try to look at your own behavior as an outsider and to ask, what are you doing? And why are you doing it? And what are its likely consequences? So much of international relations, writings in both practice and theory are focused on understanding others. And this is important. I don't mean in any way to diminish how important this is. However, we first need to understand ourselves. And there's very little focus on this in theory and practice. People just take their own assumptions and views for granted. Ours are rational. Somehow there's something wrong or different about the others. That's not a useful starting point for conflict management. So know thyself, as the ancient Greeks were fond of saying, is an aphorism that's still very relevant.
Right, sir. It's very important to actually know what our objectives are, like what our own concerns are, before assuming that the other one is threatening them or we have a fear to them. Now, sir, since we are talking about all these strategies for the future, could you also share some practical approaches to preventing and managing conflicts that have proven effective in the real world scenarios in the past? I ask this because we cannot imagine a rectification or an improvement in our future strategies. We are aware of the ones which have worked for us in the past.
Right. Well, I've already given you one example, Egypt and Israel. 4 wars. Uh, People assumed that this conflict would go on forever. It didn't. Now, Israel and Egypt have not become friends, and there's little travel back and forth and normalization of relations. But nobody in either country believes that war between them is likely in the future. So the first step toward conflict management is defusing the likelihood of war. The second is normalization of relations. Let me give you an example here. Germany and France. Enemies on a deep level, fought wars in 1870, 1914, 1940. French public opinion polls today indicate that French people think that Germans in Germany are their closest friends. The United States and Britain come second and third. This is an astounding turnaround. I remember going to the commemorations for D-Day, the Allied landings in France in June of 1944. Alas, I have to confess, an event I remember well personally because I'm that old. And for the first time, it must have been at the 50th anniversary of these events, the Germans were invited to participate. And the German foreign minister made a speech saying that they were equally joyous about it because it was the first day of their liberation as well. How did this happen? How do you make enemies friends in the aftermath of a a brutal occupation of your country by the other? Well, for a start, European institutions developed. The entire European project was initially had as its motive controlling the Germans and making sure they would not start yet another war. So coal and steel, the two requisites of an industrial economy and military might, were put under international control. People discovered that this had advantages beyond the control of Germany. It spread. And more institutions brought more and more people together. And it not only created a sense of trust, it created friendships at the personal level. Example, for a period of about 20 years, I lectured twice a year at the NATO Defense College in Rome, where officers would come, generally, if they were from the Army, lieutenant colonels or colonels. They would come for the year from all NATO countries. So Turks would meet Greeks, French, Germans, and they'd establish personal relationships. Those relationships would continue over the course of their careers. If you needed something, oh, I have a friend in the German army, I'll give him a call, see what we can do. And it socialized Southern European countries, Spain, Italy, and Greece, into being different in how they behaved, because the officers wanted to be accepted, standing and self-esteem by the officers from Northern Europe and the Americans and the British. But to do this, their militaries had to play a different role. They couldn't carry out coups, they couldn't intervene in domestic politics, they had to behave differently, which they did. Schools. I have a very close friend, Stefano Guzzini, who now teaches at the European University in Florence, whose family were Italian workers who emigrated, his father was, to Germany, married a German woman in Trier. When Stefano went to school, a program had been set up by the Germans and French. So every other year, the kids went to school in the other country. So his schooling divided, half in France, half in Germany, knew both languages, knew the teachers. This created friendships. So working at the highest institutional levels and the lowest personal levels, by managing appetite, by enabling self-esteem, and by reducing fear, it brought about a fundamental change in the relationship between the two peoples. And it's important not only for Germany and France, but for Europe, because the German-French rapprochement has been the pillar of European post-war peace.
Right, so I think the example, or rather the normalization efforts that went down between the French and the Germans stand as a good example for all the warring states in today's world. And I think the future ones shall also build upon these efforts only. And it should be a better one when we understand each other well, when we understand each other's psychology well, when we understand each other's perspectives well, as you mentioned before. Now, sir, before we end this interesting conversation, how do you see the theoretical aspects of war and strategy evolving in response to our contemporary global challenges?
Evolving in response to, tell me again?
Contemporary global challenges.
Oh, contemporary challenges.
Yes, sir.
Well, so let's take the 900-pound gorilla in the room, so to speak, meaning the thing that affects all of us, but that we don't talk about. It's called climate change. There are, of course, deniers, but we need to ignore them. We need to recognize that what we've done and are doing to the earth threatens to transform it in a way to make life very difficult and very threatening to our descendants. We need to address it while we still have time. And the time is running out. And yet we pay far more attention and spend far more money on doing things that will give us control over this territory or that territory than we do with addressing more fundamental threats to our very existence. So climate change and the threat it creates should also create an opportunity. And that opportunity should be to overcome these petty differences which create conflicts among us and make it difficult for us to coordinate behavior in a way to address climate change. So that seems to me a fitting endpoint for my remarks.
Surely, sir, that's a very important point that you put forward. That is climate change, which doesn't get that much of an limelight in our daily lives, right? So, I think your analysis on the evolution of theoretical aspects of war, that is climate change, is both enlightening and thought-provoking. We can only wait and see how the evolution actually plays out, how we actually play out our role in mitigating climate change or rather adapting to it. With that, sir, I think we have come to an end to this interesting conversation with you today. It was really an enriching and an extremely helpful one on our part in understanding the intricate equations involved while aiming at successful conflict resolution, and either theoretically or practically. We are sure that our viewers will find your observations insightful and will take away valuable lessons on theories of IR. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you, and we look forward to hosting you again in the future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking such intelligent questions.